She had 6 seconds before the first charge blew. Emily Carter knew this because she'd seen this exact pattern before. The timing, the sequence, the deliberate gap between the initial burst and the follow-up detonation designed to catch responders in the open. She knew it in her bones, in the part of her that had been trained to read chaos like a language. But nobody in that room knew any of that. To them, she was a nurse, a quiet, unremarkable woman in scrubs who had wandered too close to a briefing screen. Chief Mason Drake's voice cut through the operations center like something he'd been saving up for weeks. "Remove her from my base, immediately." Every head turned. Emily didn't flinch. She was already looking at the monitor behind him, at the blip on the harbor tracking system that nobody else had registered yet, at the pattern that was arranging itself into something catastrophic. Then the alarms hit. If you've made it this far, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story is going to go places you won't expect. If this is your kind of content, hit follow, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. 6 months earlier, Emily Carter had driven a rented sedan through the main gate of Harbor Ridge Naval Station with 2 duffel bags, a sealed personnel file, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from years of holding yourself completely still. She was 31. She had brown hair she kept pulled back because it was practical, not because she cared about looking neat. She had a small scar along her left collarbone that she never explained, and a way of scanning every room she walked into that people sometimes noticed and then forgot. She had been assigned to Harbor Ridge as part of a joint medical support rotation, one of several nurses and medics cycling through the installation to support the SEAL teams and special operations personnel who trained there. The base was not particularly large. It sat along the northern edge of a coastal inlet in a stretch of the country where the winters were long and the water was gray for 8 months out of the year. The nearest town, Caro Point, had a diner, a hardware store, and a population that had been declining slowly for 30 years. The base itself was self-contained, tightly run, and had the particular atmosphere of a place where everyone knew their rank and expected everyone else to know it too. Emily had been in places like this before. Different geography, different personnel, same basic social architecture. She understood how it worked. She kept her head down, did her job, and spent her off hours in her quarters reading or running the perimeter trail alone before dawn. The medical unit she joined was small. 6 nurses, 2 doctors, a handful of medics, all of them subordinate to the base's chief medical officer, a tired man named Lieutenant Commander Paul Ferris, who was 6 months from retirement and had stopped fighting most battles at least 2 years ago. He processed Emily's paperwork, showed her the supply room and the procedure logs, and told her that the SEAL teams were generally healthy and generally unhappy about being sent to medical for any reason. "They'll ignore you when they can and resent you when they can't," he said. "Don't take it personally." Emily said she wouldn't. She meant it, mostly. The first time she encountered Mason Drake was in the corridor outside the operations wing, 2 weeks into her assignment. He was coming out of a briefing room with 2 junior officers trailing behind him, all 3 of them moving with the particular purposefulness of men who considered their own time significantly more valuable than anyone else's. Drake was 44, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and a way of occupying space that was less about physical size and more about the assumption that everyone around him would adjust. He had an excellent service record, several commendations, and a reputation for getting results that had survived at least 2 complaints that Emily would only learn about much later. He stopped when he saw her, not because he recognized her, because she was in his path. "Medical's on the south end," he said. "I know," Emily said. "I was just—" "Then you know you're not cleared for this corridor." She was, actually. Her rotation included access to the operations support wing for coordination purposes. She had the documentation in her personnel file. She could have said this. She chose not to, because she had been in enough environments to know when a conversation was an invitation to a power demonstration rather than an actual exchange of information. She nodded, stepped aside, and let him pass. He didn't look at her again. It set the tone for everything that followed. Over the next several weeks, Drake made his position clear through a series of small, consistent actions that were individually dismissible and collectively unmistakable. He redirected medical briefings so that nursing staff weren't included. He referred to the medical unit and planning meetings as support personnel, in a tone that drew a clear line between that category and real contributors. When Emily submitted a written observation about a pattern of minor injuries among one of the training teams that suggested equipment fatigue, Drake's aide sent back a one-line response. Not within your scope of assessment. She rewrote it, framed it as a supply chain concern rather than an operational one, and resubmitted it through Ferris. It was acknowledged and then quietly filed away. She told herself it didn't matter. She was here to do medical work, not to insert herself into operations planning. She had spent years learning how to exist in environments where she was tolerated rather than welcomed, and she had learned to draw the line between what was worth fighting and what wasn't. The thing was, she kept noticing things. It was not something she could turn off. Years of training had made pattern recognition as automatic as breathing, the slightly off schedule of a supply delivery that should have been routine. The unfamiliar vehicle parked outside the communications building 3 mornings in a row. The new harbor master's assistant who asked too many questions about training rotation schedules during what should have been a mundane logistics conversation. She logged all of it in a personal notebook she kept in her quarters, not because she thought anyone would read it, because the habit of documentation had been drilled into her so deeply that she did it the way some people kept diaries. She mentioned the vehicle to Ferris once, framed it carefully, and he told her to report non-medical concerns to security if she felt strongly about it. She went to the base security office once and spoke to a young petty officer who listened politely and wrote nothing down. She did not go back. 6 weeks into her assignment, during a joint planning session she'd been brought into to coordinate medical support for a large training exercise, Drake saw her name on the participant list and had her removed before the meeting started. He didn't do it directly. He had an aide deliver the message. But the aide was apologetic in a way that made the source obvious. Chief Drake's preference is that medical liaison attend the debrief rather than the planning session, the aide told her outside the conference room door. Emily stood there for a moment. Understood, she said. She went back to the medical unit, updated her supply inventory, and checked on a petty officer who was recovering from a dislocated shoulder. She was efficient and thorough, and she did not allow herself to think about the meeting for the rest of the afternoon. The humiliation, and she was honest enough with herself to call it that, compounded over time, not in any single dramatic incident, but in the slow grinding accumulation of small signals that added up to a clear message. You don't belong here. You're beneath the threshold of serious consideration. Stay in your lane and eventually you will be transferred somewhere else, and everyone will be relieved. Drake said it out loud, finally, 3.5 months into her assignment. It happened at the end of a morning brief that Emily had been permitted to attend for medical coordination purposes. One of the SEAL team leaders had asked a direct question about injury risk assessment for a new training protocol, specifically about the risk of traumatic head injury during a particular breach simulation. The medical officer who should have answered was Ferris, but Ferris had been called out minutes earlier to deal with a supply issue, and the room had looked at Emily, because she was the only medical staff present. She answered the question, accurately, concisely, with 2 specific recommendations for protocol modification that would reduce risk without significantly altering the training objective. She had seen versions of this problem before. In a different context she didn't explain, and her answer was clean and technically sound. Drake waited until she finished. Then he said, without looking at her, "We'll get the assessment from someone qualified." The room went quiet. Not because anyone was surprised, exactly, because he'd said it in front of everyone. And there was something about that kind of public reduction that required a moment of acknowledgement, even from people who weren't going to say anything about it. Emily said nothing. She gathered her materials and left the room. She did not let herself feel it until she was alone in the medical supply corridor, and even then, she only allowed herself about 45 seconds before she straightened up and went back to work. 2 weeks after that, she found something in the security logs that genuinely alarmed her. She'd been given limited access to the base security database for medical reasons, tracking injury incidents, coordinating with security on substance testing, administrative overlap. In reviewing a routine incident log, she'd noticed an entry that had been flagged and then deflagged without resolution. A perimeter sensor near the Northern Harbor access point had triggered on 3 separate nights over a 10-day period. The trigger times clustered around 0200. The deflagging notation simply read, "False alarm confirmed." She'd seen that kind of notation before, and she knew that what it actually meant, in practice, was that someone had decided it was a false alarm without fully investigating it. She pulled the adjacent logs. The sensor pattern was consistent with a specific type of reconnaissance method. Small teams, deliberate timing, using the natural noise window created by boat traffic in the adjacent inlet to mask movement. She wrote it up, detailed and specific, and sent it through the appropriate channel to the base security supervisor. 3 days later, she received a response. Sensor anomalies have been reviewed and determined to be consistent with wildlife activity in the harbor area. No further action required. She sat with that response for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She made a copy of her original report, saved it in an encrypted file on a personal device, and sent a second copy through a contact she'd maintained from a previous chapter of her life. Not with any specific requests, just flagged as something to be aware of. She wasn't sure why she did it. Old habits, maybe. The same instinct that made her keep the notebook. 2 days after that, Drake called her into his office. He didn't offer her a seat. "I've been reviewing your performance record," he said, which they both knew meant he'd been reviewing the complaints she'd submitted that had gone nowhere. "And I've spoken with the base commander about the medical rotation schedule." "Okay," Emily said. "Your assignment here is being discontinued. You'll be reassigned within the next 14 days. He said it like he was reading from a form. "The official reason will be rotation completion." She looked at him for a moment. "Is there an unofficial reason?" "You've created friction in an environment that requires cohesion," Drake said. "You've submitted reports outside your designated scope on multiple occasions. You've inserted yourself into operational conversations that weren't your concern. I submitted medical and security assessments through appropriate channels. That's your characterization." He picked up a file folder, which meant the conversation was over as far as he was concerned. "Ferris will coordinate your transition paperwork." Emily walked out of his office, down the corridor, out a side door into the cold air off the harbor. She stood there for a minute, breathing steadily, watching the gray water move. 14 days. She thought about the sensor logs. She thought about the supply vehicle. She thought about the harbor master's assistant and his questions about rotation schedules. She thought, "I need to make some calls." She didn't because she told herself she was overreacting. Because she'd been told enough times that her assessments were outside her scope that some part of her had started to wonder if that was true. Because the gap between what she had been and what she appeared to be had widened to the point where she sometimes had trouble seeing across it herself. She went back inside and started reviewing her reassignment options. The day the operations center fell quiet started like any other. Emily was in the medical unit doing inventory on a Tuesday morning when the base shifted tone in a way she felt before she understood it. A change in the frequency of radio traffic, a change in how people were moving in the corridors. She came out of the supply room and stopped a passing petty officer. "What's happening?" "Training exercise, South Harbor. 2 SEAL teams." She went back to her work. Training exercises were constant here. The base existed to run them. 40 minutes later, she was called to the operations center. She didn't know why she was called. She suspected Ferris had listed her on a medical support roster for the exercise, and that someone had sent the notification automatically. Whatever the reason, she walked into the operations center at 0940 to find it crowded with personnel, 2 large screens running real-time tracking data from the harbor, and Drake standing in the center of the room running a command coordination sequence with 3 of his officers. He saw her immediately. "Remove her from my base," he said. Not loudly, precisely. Immediately. Emily was looking at the secondary tracking monitor. She saw the blip she'd seen from the doorway, the one that had registered wrong, not in the pattern of a training vessel, not in the sequence of any scheduled support craft. She saw the gap in the timing, the 2-minute window between that anomalous marker and the next scheduled communications check. She recognized it because she had studied this specific methodology in a context she had never disclosed to anyone at Harbor Ridge. She opened her mouth. The first explosion hit before she could speak. It was not close. The sound arrived as a concussive wave rather than an immediate blast, which told her it was harbor adjacent rather than base direct. The room erupted into motion. Drake was already on the radio, calling for situation reports. Screens flickered as communications channels experienced sudden interference. Someone shouted that the primary comms relay had gone down. Someone else reported that the training teams in the South Harbor were not responding to check-in signals. The second explosion hit 40 seconds later. Closer this time, though still not inside the perimeter. It rattled the building enough that two people grabbed for desk edges. Emily moved to the secondary tracking console while everyone else was moving toward the primary communications bank. A lieutenant named Carver stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, you need to clear the—" "I need this screen for 30 seconds, she said. "You're not cleared to—" "30 seconds. She held his gaze. "If I'm wrong, you have me removed. Give me 30 seconds. Something in her voice made him step aside. She wasn't sure what it was. She'd been told before that she had a particular quality in genuine emergencies, a stillness that read as certainty, a steadiness that functioned like authority even when the formal designation wasn't there. She'd never been able to describe it or manufacture it deliberately. It was just what happened when everything around her turned into actual crisis. She pulled up the tracking overlay, cross-referenced the anomalous signal with the sensor log she'd read 6 weeks ago, and laid the pattern against the timing of the explosions. It fit. Exactly. She turned to the room. "You have 2 more detonation points," she said. "One at the northern communications relay, one at the secondary power junction on the east perimeter. The harbor teams aren't responding because their communications were targeted first, standard isolation protocol. The South Harbor SEAL team is likely pinned, not eliminated. You have a window of approximately 8 to 11 minutes before the third device goes off." The room had gone silent in the way that rooms go silent when someone says something that doesn't fit any established category. Drake was staring at her. "How do you know that?" A senior officer named Commander Albright said it, not as an accusation, more as genuine disorientation. Emily said, "Because I dealt with this exact tactic during my military deployment." Nobody moved for a full second. Then Drake took 2 steps toward her, and his expression had shifted from dismissal into something harder to read. "You're a nurse," he said. "Right now I'm the only person in this room who's seen this method used in the field," she said. "You can argue about my credentials after the window closes. Or you can listen." Albright looked at Drake. Drake's jaw was set. He said nothing. Albright said, "What do we do?" Emily had been thinking about it since the first explosion. She pulled up the base map and started talking. She laid out the counteraction sequence in clear, sequential terms, not because she was performing competence, but because the information needed to move fast, and there wasn't room for uncertainty in the delivery. She told them which channels to use for the pinned teams, how to avoid the compromised relay, what the likely extraction route for the aggressors looked like based on the geography of the harbor inlet, and where to position the response units to maximize coverage while keeping them out of the blast radius of the third device if her timing estimate was wrong. She was not perfectly calm. Her hands were braced against the edge of the console, and she could feel her heart rate elevated, and she made at least one sentence more complicated than it needed to be and had to back up and rephrase it. She was human, and she was under pressure, and it showed. But the information was correct, and it was coming out, and the people in the room were starting to listen. Drake had not moved. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully parse. Not quite disbelief, not quite acknowledgement, somewhere in the uncharted territory between them. "The SEAL team in the South Harbor," Albright said. "Can we get to them in time?" "If you move in the next 4 minutes," Emily said. "Yes." Albright made the call. The room shifted from paralysis to motion. Radio channels opened, units began moving. The rapid response protocol that had stalled in the first confused minutes of the attack began to execute. Emily stayed at the console, tracking, updating, passing information to the communicators as it developed. At minute 7, the northern relay detonated, exactly where she'd said it would. At minute 9, the response team reached the South Harbor and began extracting the pinned SEAL units. At minute 11, 3 individuals were detained near the east perimeter access point, armed in the process of approaching the secondary power junction. The attack had been neutralized. The South Harbor team came back with 6 personnel, 2 of them with injuries significant enough to require immediate medical attention, 4 others with minor trauma. Emily shifted roles without announcement, moving to the triage position, working alongside the medical team that arrived as the personnel were brought in. She started 2 IVs, managed a pneumothorax with equipment that wasn't quite what she would have chosen, and talked a young petty officer through a controlled breathing sequence while a medical officer took over the more complex case beside her. She was in the middle of this when a new aircraft appeared over the base. A military transport that wasn't on any scheduled manifest, circling once before setting down on the main pad. 2 men and a woman stepped out in civilian clothes with federal identification. They bypassed Drake at the landing pad entrance. They bypassed Commander Albright. They asked the first person they encountered where Emily Carter was. Emily was still in the medical triage area, her hands taped inside gloves that had a small tear in the left thumb. Her hair escaped from its tie in about 3 different places when the federal lead investigator walked in and introduced himself as Special Agent Harlan Voss from the Defense Security Service. He said, "We need to talk, Ms. Carter. We've been looking for this operation for 6 months." She pulled off her gloves. She thought about the encrypted file she'd sent 2 months ago. She thought about the notebook in her quarters with the dates, the vehicle descriptions, the sensor log anomalies. She said, "How much do you know?" "Enough," Voss said. "Not enough. That's why we're here." She nodded. "I'll get my notebook," she said. Behind Voss, through the open door of the triage bay, she could see Drake across the compound, standing near the operations building with 2 of his aides, watching the federal team move through his base. From this distance, she couldn't read his expression, but she could read his posture. She'd seen that posture before, on other men, in other places. The particular stiffness of someone who has just understood that something they buried a long time ago has been found. She turned back to Voss. "There's more than the notebook," she said. "I want to show you the security logs, the originals, before they were marked resolved." Voss looked at her for a moment. "You kept copies," he said. "I kept copies," she said. He almost smiled. "Of course you did." She was already moving toward the door when one of Drake's aides crossed the compound at a near run in the direction of the communications building, and Voss's team moved to intercept without being told to. And somewhere across the harbor, the smoke from the northern relay fire was still rising in a thin, dark column against the overcast sky. And Emily Carter walked out of the triage bay into the cold air with a notebook that contained 6 months of careful, quiet, disregarded observations about to become the most important document on the base. The notebook had a blue cover, spiral-bound, the kind sold in any college bookstore for $3. Voss held it with more care than its appearance suggested it deserved. They were in the base commander's conference room, a room Emily had never been inside before today, which said something about the last 6 months that she chose not to dwell on. Voss sat across from her with his 2 colleagues, a younger man named Reyes, who hadn't introduced himself by rank, and a woman named Aldrich, who had said almost nothing since arriving, and who Emily instinctively trusted more than either of the men because of it. A base security officer stood near the door. Commander Albright was present, seated at the far end of the table, his expression the particular arrangement of someone managing shock through procedural focus. Drake was not in the room. Emily had noted that immediately. "Walk me through the sequence," Voss said, opening the notebook to the first page. His tone was professionally neutral, the kind of neutral that takes effort to maintain. "Starting with the first anomaly you logged." "October 14th, Emily said. "Supply delivery, scheduled for a Tuesday window, arrived Thursday. Different driver, different vehicle, same manifest number. I flagged it at the time as a possible administrative error." "But you logged it anyway." "I logged things." Aldrich looked up from her tablet. All 3 sensor triggers were on nights with high boat traffic in the inlet. "Yes," Emily said. "That's consistent with acoustic masking. Small team, using the ambient noise to stay below the sensor threshold. The triggers happened anyway because the sensor calibration hadn't been updated to account for the new traffic pattern after the harbor master changed the scheduling in September." Burr Reyes said, "How did you know about the scheduling change?" The harbor master's assistant mentioned it during a logistics coordination meeting in early October. He seemed very interested in the fact that training rotations hadn't adjusted to the new traffic window. Voss and Reyes exchanged a look over the notebook. "The assistant," Voss said, "Tobias Wren." The name landed in the room with a particular weight that told Emily it wasn't a new name to them. "I don't know his full name," she said. "I only met him twice." "He's in custody," Aldrich said. "Detained at the East Perimeter, one of the 3. Emily absorbed that. She'd suspected as much when Voss's team moved to intercept Drake's aide 20 minutes ago, But suspicion and confirmation were different things, and she allowed herself 2 seconds to sit with the confirmation before moving on. "The security logs," she said. "I want to show you the deflagging pattern." She pulled out her personal tablet and brought up the encrypted file she'd made 6 weeks ago, a compressed screenshot sequence of the original sensor entries before they'd been marked resolved. The timestamps were intact, the modification records were intact, and the name attached to the deflagging authorization was visible in the metadata, small and clear and unambiguous. She turned the tablet toward Voss. He looked at it for a long moment. "This was filed through the base security office," he said. "Filed and ignored," Emily said. "The response I received told me the sensor triggers were consistent with wildlife." "Who signed off on that response?" "I have the name in the notebook, page 9. Voss turned to page 9. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly, the way a calculation shifts when a new variable confirms what you'd already suspected. Outside the conference room, the base was still moving through the aftermath of the morning. Vehicles, personnel, the distant sound of the recovery operation in the South Harbor completing its work. Through the single window, Emily could see 2 federal vehicles parked near the communications building, and she could see Drake standing near the entrance to the operations wing, with his arms crossed, and his posture doing the thing she'd noticed before. Rigid in a way that wasn't discipline. Rigid in the way of a man standing next to a door he knows is about to close. "Ms. Carter," Voss said, setting the tablet down, "I need to ask you something directly." "Okay." "Your personnel file indicates a standard Army medic background transitioning to nursing. That's the official record." He paused. "Is that the complete record?" She'd known this question was coming since the moment Voss walked into the triage bay. She'd been deciding how to answer it for about 30 minutes. "No," she said, "it's not." The room got a degree quieter. "My full service record is classified at a level above what's in the standard file," she said. "I can give you the authorization request pathway. You'll need to go through a specific office at the DoD. I can write down the contact designation." "We already know what's in it," Aldrich said. She said it quietly, without emphasis, looking at her tablet. "We accessed it this morning before we landed." Emily looked at her. "Then you know why I recognize the attack method," Emily said. "Yes," Aldrich said. "We do." Albright, at the far end of the table, made a sound, not quite a word, more the verbal equivalent of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. He'd been commander of this installation for 2 years. He'd signed the medical rotation paperwork that brought Emily here. He'd also been present in the room when Drake had her removed from the planning session, and when Drake's aide had delivered the reassignment notification, and he had not intervened in either instance. He said, "Can someone explain what we're actually talking about?" Voss looked at Emily. She said, "Before I transitioned to nursing, I spent 4 years embedded with Joint Special Operations in 3 different active environments. My role included tactical medical support and operational intelligence assessment in 2 of those deployments. I left that assignment voluntarily for medical reasons that are also in the classified file." She paused. "The attack method used this morning was a variant of an infiltration and disruption protocol I encountered in my 2nd deployment. The original version was attributed to a specific contractor network operating in the region at that time. Several members of that network were subsequently prosecuted. A residual cell was believed to have remained active." The room was completely still. "That cell," Voss said, "is what we've been tracking for 18 months. "And they came here," Emily said. "They came here," he confirmed. "The question we're working on is why they came here specifically, and who on this installation helped them understand the window." She looked at page 9 of the notebook, still open on the table in front of Voss. "You said you already suspected Drake," she said. It wasn't a question. "We suspected a coordination point inside the base," Voss said carefully. "We hadn't confirmed the individual." "The deflagging authorization narrows it considerably." "Yes," he said. "It does." She watched him close the notebook and slide it toward Reyes, who bagged it without ceremony. She felt a brief irrational reluctance, 6 months of careful documentation disappearing into an evidence bag, and then let it go. That was what the notebook was for. "I need to ask you something," she said. Voss waited. "The reassignment Drake processed. I was 14 days from being transferred off this base. She kept her voice level. If I'd left before this morning. We know, Voss said. He didn't say it with particular warmth, but he said it directly. We're aware of the reassignment. It's part of what accelerated our timeline for coming here. She sat with that for a second. Someone had been watching. The encrypted flag she'd sent 2 months ago had done something after all, moved through some channel she hadn't been able to trace, reached someone who had connected it to an existing investigation and started a clock running. She hadn't known that. She'd sent the flag mostly because the habit of escalation was too deeply ingrained to suppress completely, and because some part of her that she'd been trying to quiet for 6 months had refused to stop believing that the pattern she was seeing was real. Okay, she said. What do you need from me? Everything, Aldrich said. In sequence. Don't skip anything because it seems minor. Emily pulled her chair forward. They were in that room for 3 hours. Drake requested a meeting with Voss at the 90-minute mark. The request came through Albright's aide, formally worded, and Voss declined it without explanation. Drake requested again at the 2-hour mark, this time through the base JAG officer, citing his right to understand the scope of a federal investigation affecting personnel under his command. Voss sent back a one-line response through Reyes. Chief Drake is not currently under your command's jurisdiction in this matter. Emily was in the middle of walking Aldrich through the third sensor log anomaly when Reyes brought the exchange back into the conference room. She noticed Albright's expression when he heard Drake's second request, a specific tightening around the eyes that she'd seen before on people who were recalculating how close they'd stood to something they should have kept distance from. Albright had not directly enabled Drake's actions. He had not directly suppressed anything. What he had done was defer, consistently, to Drake's authority over operational matters in a way that had created a vacuum around Emily's reports and given Drake's decisions the implicit backing of the base command structure. It was the kind of complicity that was easy to construct in retrospect because it looked, from the inside, exactly like normal institutional behavior. She didn't say this to anyone. It wasn't her job to say it. Voss's team would assemble that picture themselves. At the 3-hour mark, Voss closed his tablet. We're going to need you to remain on base, he said. Your reassignment is suspended pending the outcome of this investigation. I assumed as much. You'll be contacted for formal statement collection within 24 hours. In the meantime, he glanced at Aldrich, who made a small gesture. We'd like you to have an escort when moving through the base. Not because we believe you're at risk, but because some of the people we're about to question have been on this base for years, Emily said, and some of them are going to be looking for information about where the investigation is pointing. Yes, Voss said. Essentially. She nodded. She didn't love it, but she understood it. Being watched over had a different texture depending on who was doing it and why. She was almost at the door when Albright said, Ms. Carter? She turned. He had the look of a man choosing words with unusual care. The assessment you gave this morning, he said, in the operations center, before anyone else understood what was happening. He stopped. It was the right call. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. She didn't mean it as a rebuke. She meant it as a simple statement of fact, the same way she would have confirmed the correct dosage of a medication or the right sequence for a field dressing. She knew it had been the right call. She had known it before she made it. That was the whole problem with the last 6 months. She had known, and nobody had let it matter. She walked out of the conference room into the corridor and nearly ran into Lieutenant Carver, the officer who'd stepped in front of her in the operations center and then stepped aside when she'd asked for 30 seconds. He was standing just outside the door, and when he saw her, he straightened in a way that might have been automatic or might have been deliberate. Ma'am, he said. Carver, she said. He looked like he wanted to say something else and was having trouble with the architecture of it. She waited because she was tired and she didn't have the energy to help him find it. He said, I told the chief this morning, when he came out of the ops center and asked us what happened in there. I told him it was you, that you were the one who called it. He paused. I thought you should know. She studied him. What did he say? She asked. Carver's jaw moved slightly. He said I was confused, he said. She held that. Okay, she said. Thank you for telling me. She kept walking, upset. The base had a rhythm in the aftermath of the attack that was different from its normal operational rhythm, tighter, quieter. The particular stillness of a place where everyone understood that something had shifted, but nobody yet knew how far the shift would go. She passed personnel who looked at her differently than they had this morning, some with the open assessment of people recalibrating a prior judgment, some with the careful blankness of people who hadn't yet decided what to think. She didn't perform anything for either group. She was too tired to perform. She went to the medical unit first because that was where she should have been for the last 3 hours, and because there were still patients to check. The 2 SEAL team members who'd needed significant medical attention were stable, one with a shoulder dislocation and lacerations, one with a concussion that was being monitored. She reviewed their charts, spoke to the attending medical officer, updated 2 sets of notes. She was 40 minutes into this when Ferris appeared in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it quietly, the way someone says something they've been building up to and need to get out before the nerve goes. Emily looked up from the chart. "You don't have to do this right now," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway. I read your reports, every one of them. I thought—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought you were overestimating your scope. I thought Drake had a point about the channels, and I didn't want the friction." She watched him. He was 62 years old and 6 months from retirement, and he'd spent his career making reasonable decisions in low-stakes situations, and had arrived at this moment having made all the same reasonable decisions in a high-stakes one. That was a particular kind of failure, and it wasn't criminal, and it wasn't the same as what Drake had done, and she thought he probably understood all of that already. "Did you suppress anything?" she asked, directly. "No," he said. "I forwarded everything through channels. I just didn't push when it went quiet." "Then you didn't suppress it," she said. "You were passive. That's different." He looked at her. "That's not particularly forgiving," he said. "It's not supposed to be forgiving," she said. "It's supposed to be accurate." She set the chart down. "The patients look good. The concussion case needs 4-hour checks through the night." He nodded. The conversation was over, and they both knew it, and it had said what it needed to say. She left the medical unit with the escort Voss had assigned, a quiet young agent named Soto who wore civilian clothes and walked 2 steps behind her and had the professional, unobtrusive manner of someone trained to be present without being noticed. She was crossing the main compound toward her quarters when she saw Drake. He was coming from the direction of the JAG office, moving fast, 2 aides with him. He was on his phone, and his expression had reorganized itself from the frozen quality she'd seen earlier into something more active. The look of a man who'd switched from shock to strategy. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He stopped. She kept walking. He said, "Carter." She slowed, turned slightly toward him. Soto had moved half a step closer behind her without making it obvious. Drake looked at the escort, back at her. "This is going to unravel," he said. His voice was low, controlled. "Whatever story you've told them, it's not going to hold up under a proper review." She considered how to respond. She could say any number of things. She had 6 months of material. "I told them what I observed," she said, "dated and documented." "You had no business observing half of what you claim to have." "The notebook's been submitted into evidence," she said. "The encrypted file's already been accessed. The sensor log metadata is preserved." She paused. "Is there something specific you'd like to dispute?" His jaw worked. "You're making a serious mistake about who you're dealing with," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I've known who I was dealing with since October," she said. "You're the one who spent 6 months underestimating the situation." She turned and kept walking. Behind her, she heard Drake say something sharp and low to one of his aides, heard a phone being put to an ear, heard footsteps moving away in the direction of the communications building. Soto appeared at her elbow without comment. They walked the rest of the way to her quarters in silence. She slept 4 hours, which was less than she needed and more than she expected. When she woke, it was past 1900, and the light through her single window was the particular dark blue of a coastal evening, the water somewhere out beyond the perimeter wall reflecting nothing because the sky was fully overcast. She lay still for a moment and ran through the day the way she'd been trained to. Not emotionally, just sequentially. The attack, the operations center, the 3 hours with Voss, the corridor with Carver. Ferris. Drake's face when she'd turned and kept walking. Her phone had 2 messages. One from Aldrich, confirming the formal statement appointment for 0900 the following morning. One from a number she didn't recognize, which read, "You should know they're moving the primary documentation tonight. Drake's aide has a vehicle cleared for base exit at 2100. She sat up. She read the message again. She didn't know who sent it. The number was local, a base-adjacent prefix. But beyond that, she had nothing. It could be a warning from someone inside the base who'd been watching and had made a decision. It could also be something else entirely. She looked at the time. 19:23. She had 37 minutes. She called Voss. It rang twice, then went to a message system. She left a clear, brief summary and the phone number the text had come from. Then she called Aldrich, who picked up on the first ring. "I got your message," Aldrich said before Emily could speak. "We're already moving on it." "You knew?" "We intercepted a communication from Drake's aide 20 minutes ago. We've had eyes on the vehicle bay since 1900. A pause. "Stay in your quarters, Ms. Carter." "If the documentation gets out, it won't," Aldrich said. "Stay in your quarters." Emily stayed in her quarters for approximately 8 minutes. Then she put her jacket on, told Soto she needed to go to the medical unit for a patient check, and moved across the base at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground and slow enough not to attract attention. Soto followed without challenging her, either because he believed the patient check explanation or because he'd been told to stay with her regardless of where she went. The vehicle bay was on the north side of the compound, accessible through a service corridor that connected to the maintenance wing. She wasn't heading there, she wasn't that irrational, but the route to the medical unit took her past the eastern edge of the communications building, which had a line of sight to the vehicle bay entrance. She stopped at the corner of the communications building and looked. 3 federal vehicles were positioned around the bay entrance in a configuration that was casual enough to not look like a containment and systematic enough that nothing was getting through it. Aldrich was visible near the closest vehicle, on a phone. 2 of Voss's people were standing near the bay door. Drake's aide, a young lieutenant named Graves, who Emily recognized as the one who delivered her reassignment notification, was standing between 2 agents near the bay entrance. He was not in handcuffs, but he wasn't going anywhere either. A civilian vehicle was parked behind the bay door, its trunk open. From 50 meters away, Emily could see the edge of a document case in the trunk. One of Voss's people moved toward it. Then her phone buzzed with a message from Aldrich. "I told you to stay in your quarters." Emily looked at the scene for another second. Then she texted back, "Patient check complete. Heading back now." She turned to find Soto standing 2 feet behind her, his expression professionally empty. "Medical unit's on the south end," he said. "I know," she said. "I took the long way." He said nothing. They walked back. She was almost at her quarters when Voss called. Graves had 3 encrypted drives and a physical document case with personnel files in it, he said without preamble. "We're assessing what was taken and what was being moved." A pause. "We also found a secondary phone in the vehicle. Burner. Recent communications." "Drake's?" she said. "We believe so, yes." Another pause. "Ms. Carter, the warning message you forwarded. We're tracing the number." "Okay. In the meantime, and I mean this, stay in your quarters." "You're the second person to tell me that tonight." "I'm aware," he said. "The first person was also right." He paused. "The morning's statements made clear that your assessment of the infiltration methodology was accurate to a degree that goes beyond observational judgment. I want you to know that what you did in that operations center is being noted in the correct places." She stood outside her quarters door with her key in her hand. "That's appreciated," she said. "There's one more thing." His voice shifted just slightly, from federal investigator neutral to something closer to direct human communication. "The deflagging authorization on the sensor logs, we matched it to Drake this evening. That, combined with the communication intercept from Graves and the document case, is going to be enough to move this forward formally." She processed that. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Before your statement appointment. I'd like you to be present when Drake is formally notified." He paused. "I'm making that offer because I think you've earned it, not because it's procedurally required." She thought about the operations center, about remove her from my base, about the corridor outside the conference room and the reassignment letter and 5.5 months of her notebooks being filed into silence. Yes, she said. I'll be there. She went inside, sat on the edge of her bed, and stayed there for a while in the dark, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of relief. Her phone buzzed once more. Unknown number again, different from before. The message read, "He made calls after the vehicle bay. 3 of them. Be careful tonight." She stared at the screen. 3 calls. After Graves had been detained, after the document case had been secured, which meant Drake had already known the vehicle move had failed, which meant he had a communication channel Voss's team hadn't yet locked down, which meant something was still moving that she couldn't see. She typed a message to Aldrich, forwarded the new text, and sat in the dark listening to the sounds of the base settling into its night rhythms, the distant motor of a patrol vehicle, the wind off the harbor, the particular quiet of a place where something had broken and not yet finished breaking. She didn't sleep after the second message. She sat in the dark for another 20 minutes, phone in her hand, running the logic. 3 calls after Graves was detained. Drake had known fast, too fast for it to be base gossip, too deliberate for it to be coincidence, which meant he had someone still active, still feeding him information, someone Voss's team hadn't identified or contained. The question was what he was doing with that information. A man with Drake's record didn't make 3 calls to complain. He made 3 calls because he was repositioning, moving pieces while there was still time to move them. The document case was gone, Graves was compromised, the sensor log metadata was in federal hands, so what was left that was still worth protecting? She thought about it until the answer came, and when it came, it was simple enough that she felt the cold settle in her stomach. The people he'd called. Not documents, people. The ones whose names appeared in the investigation threads, the ones who'd helped suppress her reports or signed off on deflagging authorizations or had operational knowledge of the base's security gaps, the ones who could corroborate or contradict the picture Voss was building. Drake was warning them, or coordinating them, one of the two. She forwarded this analysis to Aldrich at 2140 in a text that was 2 sentences long because Aldrich didn't need it explained at length. Then she lay down on her bed with her jacket still on and watched the ceiling until 0530 when the light outside shifted from black to dark gray and she heard the base begin to wake up. She showered, changed, drank the worst coffee the base commissary offered because it was available and she needed the caffeine, and was at Voss's temporary command post, a converted briefing room in the administrative wing, by 0630. Voss was already there. He looked like he'd slept about as much as she had. "You analyzed the calls correctly," he said when she walked in. 2 of the 3 numbers traced to personnel on this base. We brought them in at midnight. "And the 3rd? He looked at her steadily. "Off base. We're working on it." She pulled out a chair and sat down. "Drake?" "Under base escort since 0400. He can't communicate externally without our knowledge." Voss poured coffee from a thermos on the table and pushed it toward her without asking if she wanted it. "We moved the formal notification up. It's happening in 20 minutes. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Who else?" she asked. "From the base." "I can't give you names yet." "I'm not asking for names. I'm asking how far." He sat back. "Far enough that Albright is going to have to account for more than passive deference." He said it carefully, but he said it. She nodded. She'd suspected that since last night, since the recalibration she'd seen in Albright's face during the conference room, the specific quality of a man reviewing his own decisions with new information. "The formal notification," she said. "You said you wanted me present." "I do," he said. "You have the right to be in that room. Your documentation is the spine of this. But I need you to understand, it's going to be administrative and procedural. It's not going to look like what you might imagine it looking like." She looked at him. "I don't need it to be dramatic," she said. "I need it to be real." He almost nodded. "Then let's go, Shab." The room they used was the same conference room where Voss had interviewed her the day before. Someone had cleared the table and set up 2 chairs on one side, 3 on the other. Drake was already seated when they entered, his posture still carrying that rigid quality, though it had changed in texture since yesterday. Less calculation in it now. More containment. The kind of containment that takes real effort. His JAG-appointed counsel sat beside him, a young lieutenant commander named Osei, who looked like he'd also had approximately no sleep, and who was holding a legal pad with the focused attention of a man who'd reviewed his notes 4 times already and was reviewing them a 5th. Voss and Aldrich took the 2 chairs on the opposite side. Emily sat in a 3rd chair positioned slightly to the side, present but not at the table, which was deliberate and which she understood. She was a witness, not a party. Observer status with enough proximity to make it mean something. Drake looked at her when she sat down. She met his eyes. She kept her expression neutral, not because she felt neutral, but because she'd learned a long time ago that showing what you feel in a room like this costs you something you can't get back. Voss opened a folder. "Chief Mason Drake," he said, "pursuant to the Defense Security Service investigation initiated under case reference DSS-2024-7714, you are hereby formally notified that you are the subject of this investigation. The preliminary scope includes 1. Willful suppression of security anomaly reports received between October and December of this year. 2. Unauthorized deflagging of sensor alerts without documentation of investigative process. 3. Facilitation of unauthorized base access through coordination with a confirmed external network. 4. Directed personnel action against a whistleblower, specifically the reassignment order issued against Ms. Emily Carter, in a manner consistent with retaliatory suppression." He read it evenly, without inflection, like every word was already in the record before he said it. Drake said, "I'd like to address—" "You'll have the opportunity to respond through counsel," Voss said. "I'm not finished." Osei put a hand on Drake's arm. Drake went quiet. "Additionally," Voss continued, "the evidence secured from the vehicle operated by Lieutenant Graves on the evening of December 14th, including encrypted drives and a physical document case, has been assessed and contains personnel records that were removed without authorization from the base security archive. Lieutenant Graves has provided a preliminary statement. That statement is consistent with the digital evidence recovered from the communications intercept." Emily watched Drake's face during this. He was doing a version of what she'd been doing for 6 months, holding himself very still while processing information that was costing him something significant. She recognized the technique. It worked better from the outside than it felt on the inside. Osei leaned over and said something quietly in Drake's ear. Drake said, "The reassignment of Ms. Carter was within my operational authority as the reassignment has been reviewed in the context of its timing and the content of reports Ms. Carter had submitted in the preceding 6 weeks," Voss said. "The pattern is consistent with retaliatory action." He closed the folder. "You'll receive the full written notification through counsel within 2 hours. Your security clearance is suspended as of this morning. Your command responsibilities are transferred to Commander Albright pending the outcome of the investigation, and Commander Albright is separately cooperating with a parallel review of his own decisions during this period." There it was. Albright too, separate review. Emily had suspected it, but hearing it stated in sequence, Drake first, then the note about Albright, the way one thread pulled another, had a different weight than the abstract anticipation of it. Drake's jaw moved slightly. His eyes were still on Voss. He hadn't looked at Emily again since the beginning of the notification. "This is being built on the word of a nurse who was out of her designated scope on every action she took," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something under it, not quite desperation, more like a man making a last structural argument for a building he knows is already falling. Her access to those logs was incidental. Her report submissions were outside her authorized channels. Her presence in the operations center during the attack was— "Her presence in the operations center," Voss said, "preceded yours by 4 minutes. Her identification of the attack methodology allowed the response team to reach the South Harbor SEAL unit with 7 minutes to spare before the tertiary device detonated. Her analysis has been reviewed and validated by 2 independent tactical analysts with direct knowledge of the methodology she identified." He paused. "The scope argument is not available to you in this context, Chief Drake." Drake said nothing more. Osei started writing on his legal pad. Voss looked at Emily. She gave him a small nod, stood, and left the room without looking at Drake again. So, the base was different outside that door. Literally the same compound, same gray sky, same harbor smell off the water, but the quality of it had changed. She stood in the corridor for a moment and breathed. Carver was there. She hadn't noticed him when she'd walked in. and she didn't know if he'd been waiting or if it was coincidental, but he was standing near the far end of the corridor, and when he saw her, he straightened slightly. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went," she said. He nodded. He had the look of someone who'd been revising his understanding of a situation and hadn't finished revising it yet. She walked past him toward the medical unit because she had a patient to check, a concussion case that needed its morning assessment, and because putting one foot in front of the other in the direction of the next concrete task was how she'd gotten through every difficult morning in her adult life. She was halfway across the compound when Reyes fell into step beside her. "We have a problem," he said, quiet, no preamble. She kept walking. "Tell me." "The third call Drake made last night. Off-base number. We traced it this morning." He paused. "It went to someone in the regional DSS field office." She stopped. She turned to look at him. "A mole," she said. "We don't know what the contact represents yet," he said, which was the careful answer, and the careful answer meant yes. "But the number belongs to an analyst who has had access to case reference DS S-2024-7714 since it was opened." She ran it through fast. 18 months. Voss had said they'd been tracking the cell for 18 months. If someone inside the investigating office had been feeding information to Drake's network, that meant the investigation itself had been shaped by what was allowed to surface. Evidence prioritized or deprioritized, leads that went cold at convenient moments. The reason it had taken 18 months and still hadn't resolved before the attack forced it open. "Does Voss know?" she said. "He's being briefed right now," Reyes said. "He's pulled Aldrich and 2 other agents into a separate channel. Everything goes compartmentalized from here." "What about the case against Drake?" "The on-base evidence is solid. The notebook, the metadata, the drives from the vehicle, Graves' statement. None of that runs through the field office channel." He paused. "But the broader investigation, the cell, the network, the off-base connections, that's now contaminated." She absorbed this. "They'll try to stall," she said. "If the analyst knows we've traced the call, they'll start suppressing or redirecting." "Probably already happening." She started walking again. He kept pace. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He was quiet for 3 steps. "Because you're the only person on this base who's been right about everything since October," he said. "And Voss wants your read on something." He handed her a folded paper, printed, not digital, which told her the compartmentalization was already running. "The methodology you identified yesterday, the cell's operational approach. We found a secondary site." She unfolded the paper. A grid reference and 3 lines of tactical description. She read it twice. The secondary site was 12 kilometers north, an abandoned maritime facility on the inlet. The description matched a staging pattern she'd seen before, so not identical, but structurally similar. The kind of location used not for a primary operation, but for a relay point. A place where people or materials moved through rather than originated. "This is where the third call was supposed to route support from," she said. "That's what we think. If someone in the field office flagged your surveillance of Drake last night, the people at that site already know you're looking at it." "Yes." She kept walking, the paper in her hand, the gray morning moving around her. "What does Voss want from me specifically?" "Your assessment of whether the site will be evacuated or held," Reyes said. "Whether it's worth moving on in the next few hours, or whether you move too fast and find an empty building." She thought about it. The methodology she knew. The cell's operational logic. The way they balance speed against exposure. The specific calculation of when to cut a position and when to hold it. "They'll hold it," she said. "If they believe the investigation is focused on Drake and the on-base network, they'll hold the relay point because losing it disrupts their extraction capacity. They don't know yet that you've traced the call to the field office analyst. If that information stays contained for the next 6 to 8 hours, it will," Reyes said. "Voss sealed the channel." "Then yes," she said. "They'll hold. You have a window." Reyes nodded once, took the paper back, and turned off toward the administrative wing without another word. She continued to the medical unit, where the concussion patient was awake and alert and deeply unhappy about being in a hospital bed, which was an excellent prognostic sign. She ran through his assessment. Light sensitivity unchanged, verbal response sharp, motor coordination stable, and updated his chart with clean handwriting because her handwriting deteriorated when she was exhausted, and she was making herself be precise. She was finishing the chart note when her phone rang. Voss. "The secondary site," he said. "We're moving in 4 hours. I need you on comms support." "Comms support," she said. "Tactical medical assessment as the team moves in case we have casualties. And I need someone who can identify secondary staging indicators on the fly. Someone who's seen this methodology before and can tell us in real time whether what we're finding is consistent with an active position or a decoy." She set the chart down. "I'm not tactical personnel," she said. "I don't have current field clearance." "I'm aware of what you are and aren't," he said. "I'm asking if you're willing." She looked at the patient in the bed, who was looking back at her with the incurious steadiness of someone who was feeling better and wanted to leave. "Yes," she said. "Be at the North Vehicle Bay at 1300, Voss said. "Bring the notebook." "The notebook's in evidence." "I made a copy," he said, and hung up. She put her phone in her pocket and stood still for a moment in the middle of the medical unit, surrounded by the small, clean sounds of a functioning ward. The beep of a monitor, the distant murmur of a nursing exchange at the far station, the particular neutral smell of a medical space doing its ordinary work. 4 hours. She had 4 hours, and then she was going back into the field in a manner she hadn't anticipated when she'd driven through this base's gate with 2 duffel bags and a sealed personnel file 6 months ago. She'd spent 6 months being systematically told she was out of her scope, below the threshold, irrelevant to anything that mattered here. She went to finish the chart note. She had 2 other patients to see before 1300, and she was going to see them properly, because that was also part of the job. The part that had never stopped being her job, even when everything else was in motion around it. She was updating the second chart when Aldrich called. Not Voss. Aldrich. Her voice was different from its usual professional flatness, tighter, more controlled in a way that meant the control was working hard. "Miss Carter, the analyst we traced Drake's third call to." "Yes," Emily said. "She's gone," Aldrich said. "She left the field office at 0700, and her vehicle's been found abandoned on the coast road, 11 kilometers north of the base." Emily's hand tightened on the phone. 11 kilometers north, 1 kilometer from the secondary site. "She's not a hostage," Emily said. The certainty of it hit her before she'd finished forming the sentence. "She went there voluntarily." A beat of silence. "That's Voss's assessment too," Aldrich said. "We're moving the timeline up. We need you at the vehicle bay in 40 minutes. Emily set down the chart. "I'll be there in 20, she said. She was at the vehicle bay in 18 minutes, not 20, because the 2 minutes felt like a margin she couldn't afford to waste. Voss was already there with Reyes and 4 tactical agents Emily hadn't seen before. 2 men and 2 women in civilian gear that did nothing to disguise the way they moved. The particular economy of people who'd done this kind of work long enough that the preparedness was structural rather than performed. One of them was checking a medical kit and looked up when Emily approached, assessing her quickly and professionally without making a thing of it. "You're Carter," she said. "Yes. Delray, I'm the team medic." She said it without hostility but with clarity, establishing the hierarchy in the field before they moved, which was correct and which Emily respected. "You'll be on comms support from the second vehicle unless we have a mass casualty situation. If that happens, I need you at the forward position immediately. Do not wait for instruction." "Understood." Delray handed her an earpiece and a vest. Emily put both on without comment. Voss was on a phone call at the far end of the bay, his back partially turned. His posture, the tight, contained version she'd learned, meant the news being received was not good. Reyes caught her eye and made a small motion toward the vehicles. "Get in. We'll brief moving." She got in. They were through this base gate in 4 minutes, 2 vehicles running without lights or markings on a coast road that was empty at this hour. The gray water visible in stretches through the scrub and low trees to the right. The light was flat and cold. In the lead vehicle, Voss's voice came through the earpiece, with the acoustic quality of someone speaking in a moving car. "Current assessment on the site," he said. "The facility is a decommissioned maritime maintenance depot, roughly 4,000 square feet of covered structure plus external equipment bays. Last legitimate use was 8 years ago. The inlet access is still functional. There's a usable dock on the north face." A pause. We have satellite imagery from this morning showing two vehicles on the property. One van, one sedan. We do not have imagery of the analyst, Mara Solis, inside the structure, but her phone last pinged 600 meters from the site at 0740. Emily processed the name. Mara Solis, DSS S Field Analyst. The person Drake had called at 2100 the night before, after the vehicle bay operation had failed, after Graves was in custody. The third call. What's Solis's access level? Emily asked through the comms. Comprehensive, Voss said. She's been on the cell investigation since it opened. She had full case documentation access, source protection files, and the identities of two confidential informants we've been running inside the network. Emily looked out the window at the passing scrub. The informants, she said. We've been trying to reach both since 0600, Voss said. Neither has responded. The vehicle kept moving. Emily stared at the water through the trees and ran the math on what that meant and arrived at an answer she didn't want. The depot came into view from the coast road as a low gray structure half hidden behind a stand of maritime pine, the kind of building that had been designed to be functional rather than visible. A chain-link perimeter ran along the road-facing side, the gate standing open, the chain that had presumably secured it lying in the gravel. The two vehicles Voss had described were visible from 100 meters, van near the main structure entrance, sedan parked at an angle that suggested quick arrival rather than deliberate positioning. They stopped 200 meters short. Delray's voice through the comms. No movement visible on the exterior. Dock access on the north face is the extraction point if this goes wrong. Voss. Reyes, take Alpha Team to the east approach. Delray, you're with me on direct entry. Carter, you stay with second vehicle until I call you forward. Confirmed, Emily said. She watched from the vehicle as the team moved. They were good. Not theatrical about it. Not slow. Just efficient in the way that actual competence looks from the outside, which is usually less impressive and more reassuring than the dramatic version. They reached the structure's main entrance in under 2 minutes, stacked at the door, and went in. The comms went tense and quiet. She counted. 20 seconds, 30, 40. Reyes. East approach clear, storage bay empty. Voss. Main floor clear, moving to secondary level. Another 40 seconds. Then Del Rey. We have a person. North face, dock access. Solis. She's ambulatory, appears uninjured. She's not restrained. Emily exhaled. Then Voss. 2 males in the equipment bay. Armed. Stand by. 3 seconds of static. Then 2 sharp sounds that the comms compressed into crackling bursts, and then silence. And then Reyes. Clear. Both subjects detained. One with a graze wound, right forearm. Del Rey, I need you. Del Rey. Moving. Carter, hold position. Emily held position. She held it for approximately 90 seconds, which was long enough for Voss's voice to come back steady and clipped. Sight is secure. Carter, I need you forward. Bring the kit. She was out of the vehicle before he finished the sentence. The interior of the depot smelled like rust and old fuel and the particular dampness of a structure near salt water that had been sealed and then unsealed. The main floor was a large open space with old equipment frames along the walls, the bones of a working facility, stripped down to infrastructure. The team had the 2 detained subjects on the ground in the far corner, flex-cuffed, one of them with a dark stain spreading through his jacket sleeve that told Emily exactly where she needed to go first. She crossed to him, got down on her knees, and worked without commentary. The wound was what Reyes had called it, a graze, not a penetrating injury, but the laceration was significant enough to bleed heavily, and the angle suggested the round had skipped off the radius without fracturing it, which she confirmed by palpation, while the man watched her with an expression that was hostile and pained in equal measure. This is going to need stitches and imaging, she said to Del Rey, who was beside her with the kit open. Bone integrity needs to be confirmed, but I don't think it's fractured. Pressure dressing for now. On it, Del Rey said. Emily moved away and let her work. Mara Solis was sitting on a wooden crate near the dock access door, a federal agent positioned 2 meters away. She was in her early 40s, compact, with dark hair pulled back and the specific composure of someone who has made a decision they aren't going to pretend was made for them. She wasn't crying. She wasn't performing distress. She was sitting very still with her hands in her lap, and her eyes tracking everything in the room with a methodical quality that Emily recognized as the trained reflex of someone who spent their career assessing situations. Emily wasn't the one who should talk to Solis. That was Voss's role, and she knew it. She stayed to the side while Voss crouched to Solis's eye level and said something quietly that Emily couldn't hear. Solis responded, short, flat. Voss nodded. He stood and came back to Emily. "She's talking," he said. Voluntarily. His voice was tight. "She says the two informants are alive. She didn't give them up. She came here to warn them directly rather than through channels because she knew the channels were compromised." Emily looked at him. "She's your leak?" she said. "She's the number Drake called," Voss said. "But her version is that she's been running a parallel track for 3 months, feeding Drake's network information that was selectively wrong, managed disclosure." He paused. "If that's true, she's an asset. If it's not, she's the most sophisticated liar I've encountered this year." Emily looked at Solis across the room. The woman was watching Voss come back across the floor, and her expression hadn't changed, but there was something in how she tracked him that wasn't the calculation of someone managing deception. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been holding something classified and difficult for a very long time and had just set it down. "She's telling the truth," Emily said. Voss looked at her. "You spent 30 seconds looking at her from 20 meters away," he said. "I spent 6 months being the only person in a room who knew something everyone else needed to know," Emily said. "I know what that looks like on a person." He held her gaze for a moment. "We'll verify," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will. But she's telling the truth." They were back at the base by 1400. The two detained subjects, both of whom were subsequently identified as members of the contractor network Emily had first encountered in her second deployment, operating under cover identities that had held for nearly 2 years, were transferred to federal custody within the hour. Delray's pressure dressing held through the transfer, and the wounded man was taken directly to a regional hospital under federal escort. Mara Solis was transported separately, with Voss in the vehicle, and the conversation that happened during that transport, Emily would only learn about in fragments over the following days. What emerged in sequence was this. Solis had identified Drake's connection to the network 14 months ago, had attempted to flag it through her chain of command within the DSS field office, had been redirected and deprioritized by a supervising analyst named Rourke, who had his own reasons for the investigation moving slowly, and had made the decision 3 months ago to begin feeding Drake's network selective information designed to misdirect their operational planning while keeping the investigation's actual progress concealed. It was the kind of decision that was simultaneously defensible and indefensible, correct in method and dangerous in execution. The sort of thing that would be debated for years in closed reviews and produce no consensus verdict. Solis had operated unilaterally in a way that violated protocol and potentially preserved two informants' lives. Both things were true, and neither canceled the other. Rourke, the supervising analyst, was arrested at the DSS field office at 1600 on the same day, based on Solis's statement and a secondary document trail that Aldrich's team had been quietly assembling since morning. The arrest was not announced publicly, which meant it hit the internal networks of the relevant agencies with the particular velocity of information that hasn't been managed for public consumption, faster, messier, and with less buffer around it. Emily was in the base medical unit updating patient records when Aldrich called to tell her. "Rourke is in custody," Aldrich said. "His personal devices have been seized. We found 18 months of communication with Drake's network, including 3 instances where he redirected surveillance resources away from the harbor area during the exact windows the cell used for reconnaissance." Emily set her pen down. "He knew about the attack," she said. "He knew something was being planned," Aldrich said. "We don't yet have evidence that he knew the specific date or method. His defense will likely be that he was running his own parallel operation. Same defense as Solis." "Yes," Aldrich said. "The difference is the direction they were pointing." Emily absorbed that. "What happens to Drake now?" she said. "He's been formally transferred from base escort to federal detention pending a full disciplinary and criminal review," Aldrich said. "The JAG office is coordinating with the DSSS and the DODIG. The charges being assembled include willful suppression of security intelligence, retaliatory personnel action, and, based on what we found on the drives from Graves's vehicle, potential coordination with an external network to obstruct the investigation. Coordination, Emily said, not just suppression. The drives contained communication records between Drake and two numbers we can now associate with the contractor network, Aldrich said. The timing of those communications corresponds to the windows when your security reports were deflagged. Emily was quiet for a moment. 6 months ago, she had submitted a report about a sensor anomaly and received a one-line response telling her it was wildlife. The response had come from Drake's office. The deflagging authorization had Drake's name on the metadata. And now there were communication records between Drake and the people who had used that sensor gap to run reconnaissance on a base full of active military personnel. It was not a bureaucratic failure. It had never been a bureaucratic failure. It had been deliberate, and now the documentation existed to show it, and the man who'd done it was in federal detention, and the word that kept surfacing in Emily's mind was finally, which was inadequate and insufficient, and was what she had. The press, she said. When does this become public? Parts of it will surface within 24 hours, regardless of what we do, Aldrich said. The detention of 2 contractor network members at a federal facility is hard to contain. We're coordinating with public affairs now. A pause. Your name is going to be in it. Emily had expected that. She didn't love it, but she'd expected it. Is there anything I need to do? She said. Formal statement tomorrow morning, which we already had scheduled, Aldrich said. Beyond that, stay available. This is going to move fast. It moved faster than that. By 1800, the base had shifted again. The quality of the shift was different from the day before's. Less shock, more processing, the particular atmosphere of a community working through the recalibration of its own narrative. People who'd watched Drake run this installation for 2 years were now working alongside the information that he'd been coordinating with the people who'd attacked it, and the cognitive dissonance of that was producing a range of responses that Emily observed without inserting herself into. Carver found her in the corridor outside the operations wing at 17:30. He'd been finding her in corridors consistently over the past 2 days, which she thought was partly coincidental and partly the behavior of someone who wanted to say something and kept arriving at the proximity without quite committing to the statement. This time he committed. I knew something was off, he said. With the sensor reports. I processed one of them when it came through security. The second one, in November. I passed it to the duty officer, and it came back marked resolved the same afternoon. He stopped. I didn't push it. Emily looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because I think I need to, he said, and because Voss's team is going to find it anyway when they go through the security log chain. She considered him. He was 26, maybe 27, career Navy, the kind of earnest and procedurally correct officer who did what the system indicated and hadn't yet developed the judgment to know when the system was pointing the wrong way. Tell them now then, she said, before they find it. It's better if you bring it. Yeah, he said. I know. He looked at the floor briefly. For what it's worth. What you did in the ops center yesterday. I'm glad you were there. She looked at him. So am I, she said. She kept walking. The formal statement the following morning was 3 hours long, methodical, and significantly less dramatic than everything it was documenting. Emily sat across from 2 DODIG investigators and a DSS representative and walked through the entire sequence one more time. October to December, every report, every response, every conversation she'd logged. They had the notebook. They had the encrypted file. They had the communications intercept and the drive contents and Graves's statement and Drake's detention file. What they needed from her was the experiential connective tissue, the context that turned a collection of evidence fragments into a coherent account of what had actually happened and why. She gave it to them without editorializing. She described what she'd observed, what she'd assessed, what she'd done, and what had resulted. She described Drake's conduct precisely, without characterizing it more harshly than the facts required, because the facts required harshness enough without her adding to it. She described the moment in the operations center when she'd recognized the attack methodology and the specific basis for that recognition, which required an abbreviated account of her classified service history that the investigators received with professional calm. At the end, one of the IG investigators, a woman named Harada, who had the particular economy of someone who chose every word carefully, said, "Is there anything you observed during your assignment at Harbor Ridge that you haven't yet documented in any form?" Emily thought about it. "The reassignment letter," she said. "Drake hand-delivered the verbal notification. The paperwork was processed through Ferris." She paused. Ferris was not complicit in the suppression. He was passive. I want to distinguish that clearly. Harada noted it. "Anything else?" she said. Emily thought about Albright's face in the conference room during the first notification, the recalibration she'd read there. "Albright's passive deference to Drake created a structural cover," she said. "He signed off on things he didn't investigate. That's a command failure, but I don't believe it was coordinated." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I think the distinction matters for what happens to him." Harada looked at her for a moment. "It's noted," she said. Emily walked out of the statement room into the base corridor and stood still for a moment, because 3 hours of precise, careful recounting had used up a quality of concentration that didn't replenish immediately. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been performing precision under pressure for 2 consecutive days with inadequate sleep, and she was aware that the tiredness was not going to let her off easily for the next 12 hours. Voss was waiting outside. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from somewhere that was not the base commissary, which meant someone had made a run into Caro Point, and he handed her one without preamble. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," she said. "It went fine." He nodded. They stood in the corridor drinking coffee that was considerably better than anything the base produced, and for about 30 seconds neither of them said anything, which felt appropriate. Then Voss said, "The public affairs statement is going out at 1800 tonight. It's going to reference the attack, the detentions, and Drake's removal. It's not going to name you." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because we're trying to preserve your ability to be useful in the broader investigation," he said. "Your classified background becomes easier to protect if your name isn't in the initial press cycle." He paused. "That may change, but for now the decision is to hold your name out of the public statement." She thought about that. She understood the logic. She even agreed with it, operationally. And there was a part of her, a small, tired, human part, that had wanted the public accounting, the version of this where Drake's name and her name appeared in the same document with their roles clearly stated. She let that part be disappointed for about 5 seconds. "Okay," she said. "There will be a formal recognition process," Voss said. "That will be named. That will be public. It's just not yet." "I understand the sequencing," she said. He looked at her. "Do you want me to push for the name in the statement?" he said. It was a genuine offer, not a procedural one. She drank her coffee. "No," she said. "Do it right. Do it in the right order." He nodded. She was almost back to the medical unit when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. A third number now, different from the 2 warnings she'd received over the past 2 days. This one had an area code she didn't immediately place, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region. The message was 4 words. They found the second file. She stopped walking. Second file. She had submitted 1 encrypted file. 1. She had flagged it to 1 contact through 1 channel 2 months ago. She had never created a second file. She had never told anyone about a second file because there was no second file to tell anyone about, which meant whoever had sent this message either had wrong information or was testing her reaction, or was telling her that someone else had created a document attributed to her that she'd never written. She stood in the middle of the compound corridor with the cold harbor air coming through an open door at the far end, her phone in her hand, and she felt the specific quality of attention that she associated with the moments just before something she hadn't anticipated became a problem she had to solve. She called Voss. He picked up in 1 ring. "I just got a text," she said. "Unknown number. It says they found the second file." A beat of silence. "I don't have a second file," she said. Another beat. "I know," Voss said. His voice had changed. The carefully managed neutral had shifted into something tighter. "Emily, I need you to come back to the command post right now." She was already turning. "What is the second file?" she said. "It's a document that appeared in the DSS case archive this morning," he said. "Filed under your name, your personnel ID, dated 4 months ago. It purports to be a supplemental intelligence assessment." He paused. It contains information that, if genuine, would suggest you had prior knowledge of the attack's planning that you didn't disclose. The cold from the harbor door reached her fully. "It's fabricated," she said. "I know that," Voss said, "but it's in the archive and it has your credentials on it, and someone put it there. And I need to know who had access to your personnel ID because this changes the scope of what we're dealing with." She walked fast now, through the corridor toward the administrative wing. "Rourke," she said, "he had archive access. He could have constructed it." "Rourke's devices are seized," Voss said. "We're checking, but Rourke has been in custody since 1600 yesterday, and the document's timestamp shows it was filed at 0320 this morning, after Rourke's arrest. After Drake was in federal detention, someone else, someone who knew the investigation was closing in, who understood the document trail well enough to fabricate something technically convincing, and who had decided that if they couldn't protect Drake, they could at least create enough noise around Emily to muddy the case before it fully solidified. "How good is the fabrication?" she said. "Good enough that 2 IG analysts flagged it for verification before they contacted us," Voss said. "Which means it was constructed by someone who knows how these documents look and how they're authenticated." She pushed through the door to the administrative wing. "Who else on Drake's network had archive access?" she said. Voss was quiet for 1 second. "That," he said, "is exactly what I need you here to help me figure out." She pushed through the command post door at a pace that made the agent near the entrance step back instinctively. Voss was at the central table with Aldrich and a third person Emily hadn't seen before. A man in his 50s with a DoD contractor badge and the specific unhurried manner of someone who worked in digital forensics and had stopped being surprised by human behavior approximately 2 decades ago. His name, she would learn in the next 60 seconds, was Gareth Sund, and he'd been flown in from Washington that morning to assist with the archive investigation after Rourke's arrest had expanded the scope of what needed examining. "Show me the document," Emily said. Sund turned his laptop toward her without preamble. The file was formatted correctly. DSS Supplemental Assessment Template, her personnel ID in the header, the correct date formatting, the right classification markers. It read like something she might have written, which was the point. The language was close to her analytical style, close enough that she felt a specific kind of violation reading it, the way you'd feel finding someone wearing your face. But it was wrong in ways that only she could immediately identify. References to specific contacts she'd never had, a methodology she'd never used, and one detail that was precisely, demonstrably wrong. It cited a site location she had assessed, and then, in her actual classified records, noted as a false lead. Whoever wrote this had access to her real reports, but not to the annotation she'd added afterward. They'd built the fabrication on a foundation that looked solid until you pressed on the one spot where the floor was actually missing. She put her finger on the screen. "Here," she said. "This location. My real assessment flagged it as a decoy site in a follow-up note dated 6 weeks after the main report. The follow-up note is in the classified annex. Whoever wrote this didn't have the annex, says they only had the original." Sund leaned in, his expression sharpened. "The annex access log," he said. He was already opening a second window. If the fabricator only had the original report and not the annex was either never accessed by them or accessed by someone with a lower clearance level who couldn't see it, Aldrich said. "Rourke's clearance level," Voss said. "Rourke is in custody," Emily said. "The document was filed at 0320 this morning, after his arrest." The room went quiet with the quality of people recalculating. Sund's fingers moved over the keyboard. He pulled the archive access log, the metadata trail of who had entered the case file system, and when. His eyes moved fast, and after about 40 seconds, he stopped. "The document was uploaded through a remote access session," he said. "The session credentials belong to a DSS account designated to Rourke." He paused. "But the session IP address is not from his home network, not from his workstation, and not from any device we have registered to him." "Someone used his credentials," Aldrich said. "Someone who had his credentials before we seized his devices," Voss said, "which means the credentials were shared or stolen or given prior to his arrest." Emily straightened up. "Graves," she said. "Before Graves was detained at the vehicle bay, he was in the communications building. That's where Carver saw him running after the first vehicle operation failed. She kept her voice level and fast. If Rourke had shared archive access with Drake's network as part of whatever arrangement he had with them, Graves could have had those credentials before Rourke was arrested. Graves could have had someone outside the base use them after the arrest. Voss looked at Reyes. Reyes was already on his phone. "We need Graves in an interview room," Voss said. "Now." Graves was 23 years old and had been Drake's aide for 11 months, which meant he'd spent the better part of a year functioning as the most proximate witness to how Drake actually operated, as opposed to how Drake officially operated. He had also, by the time Voss's team sat him down for the second interview of the past 18 hours, processed enough of his situation to understand that the calculation he'd been running, protect Drake, minimize his own exposure, had become mathematically indefensible. Emily was not in that interview room. She watched through the monitoring feed in Soon's temporary workspace, which was 2 doors down and slightly too warm, with a laptop balanced on a filing cabinet and the audio coming through a single speaker that Sund had propped up with a hardcover manual. She watched Graves's face when Voss laid the fabricated document on the table in front of him. She had learned a long time ago that the moment of recognition, the moment when a person sees that you have the specific piece of information that closes off their last remaining exit, has a particular look that's hard to fake and harder to misread. Graves's face did that thing. A contraction, followed by a very brief stillness, followed by the incremental shift of someone deciding how far they're still willing to go. He didn't hold out long. He was 23, and he'd made decisions he hadn't fully understood. The weight of and the document in front of him had the specific gravity of something that was going to follow him regardless of what he said next. The question was only about degree. He gave them a name. Not Rourke, not Drake. A name Emily didn't recognize. A civilian contractor named Pierce, who had worked peripherally on DSS logistics support and who had been the person Rourke used as a pass-through when he needed something done at arm's length from his official credentials. Pierce had Rourke's archive access token because Rourke had used him to upload files before, plausibly deniable administrative support. After Rourke's arrest, Pierce had used those credentials to upload the fabricated document from a location in the city, 60 miles from the base, at 3 in the morning. Pierce was taken into custody before noon. The fabricated document was flagged in the DSS archive as compromised evidence and sequestered within the hour. The 2 IG analysts who'd flagged it for verification received an updated briefing. The case record was amended to reflect the fabrication attempt and the chain of custody that produced it. By 1400, the document that had been designed to attach a shadow to Emily's name had instead added 3 more charges to the investigation's expanding scope and provided the final connective thread between Drake's on-base conduct and the external network's operation. Voss came to find her in Soon's workspace after Pierce's arrest was confirmed. "It's done," he said. "The fabrication charge," she said. "Pierce." Pierce, Graves as an accessory, and Rourke for the credential sharing that made it possible. He sat down in the only other chair in the room, which looked like it had been stolen from a break room and had a small crack in the back support. "You identified the error in the document in under 3 minutes." "It was my document," she said, "or was supposed to be." "Most people," he said, "would have spent those 3 minutes panicking." She looked at him. "I don't panic well," she said. "It doesn't produce useful output." He almost smiled. "No," he said. "I don't imagine it does." She looked at the laptop screen, which still had the case file system open on Sun's account, the archive log visible in one corner. 6 months of her careful documentation had led here, to a room with a cracked chair and a borrowed laptop, and a federal investigator who'd called her Emily for the first time in the last 20 minutes without apparently noticing he'd made the shift. "What happens now?" she said. "Formally? The investigation continues through the DODIG and the DSS internal affairs process. Drake's case goes to a military judicial review. Rourke and Pierce face federal charges, obstruction, evidence tampering, the communications charges relating to the contractor network." He paused. "Graves has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge agreement. He'll receive a dishonorable discharge and a civilian charge that will likely result in probation given his age and the cooperation." And Solis? Voss was quiet for a moment. Solis is complicated, he said. Her managed disclosure operation wasn't authorized. It should have been. In retrospect, it was the thing that kept two informants alive and kept the investigation from being entirely neutralized by Rourke. But it wasn't authorized, and that matters institutionally. He paused. The recommendation from my office is that she receive a formal reprimand and be retained. The outcome of that recommendation is above my pay grade. Emily thought about Mara Solis on the wooden crate by the dock door. The particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a classified secret for 14 months, while the official investigation around her was being quietly sabotaged. It should go in her favor, Emily said. I agree, Voss said. I said so in my report. She nodded. And me? She said. He looked at her directly. You, he said, are being recommended for a distinguished service commendation by my office and separately by Commander Albright, who submitted a formal written statement this morning. He paused, and the pause had some weight to it. Albright also submitted a formal acknowledgement of command failure in his own conduct during the period in question. It's in the record. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected Albright to manage his exposure carefully, to cooperate with the review while constructing a defense around the passivity argument. The formal acknowledgement was something different. Not legally significant, perhaps, but the kind of thing a person does when they've decided not to split the difference between accountability and self-protection. Is he going to be all right? She said. She heard the oddness of the question as she said it, the way it didn't fit cleanly into the category of things she should be asking about. He'll take a formal reprimand, Voss said. His record otherwise is clean. He'll likely retire on schedule. He tilted his head slightly. You're asking about a man who stood in that conference room while Drake had you removed from a planning session. I know who I'm asking about, she said. People contain more than their worst decisions. Voss looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Yes, he said. They do. The formal press statement went out at 1800, as planned. Emily read it on her phone in the medical unit while she was finishing patient notes for the day. It named Drake, named Rourke, named the contractor network in general terms, referenced the attack and its neutralization, described the ongoing federal investigation. It described the actions of base medical personnel in identifying the attack methodology and coordinating the response, without naming her specifically. She read it twice. She was aware that the anonymity was practical and correct, and that she'd agreed to it. She was also aware that some part of her wanted her name in that document with the same stubbornness that had kept her writing in the notebook for 6 months when nobody was reading it. She let the feeling exist without pretending it wasn't there. And then she finished the patient notes and went to check on the concussion case, who was being discharged in the morning and who had a very strong opinion about hospital food that he'd been sharing with anyone who entered the room. She listened to his opinion on hospital food for about 4 minutes, which was longer than it warranted. But he'd been isolated from his team for 3 days, and the conversation seemed to be doing him actual good, so she didn't truncate it. When she left his room, Delray was in the corridor. They hadn't spoken since the depot. Delray had spent the afternoon in debrief with Voss's team, and Emily had been in Soon's workspace, and the paths hadn't crossed. Good work today, Delray said. She said it the way a competent person says it to another competent person. Not effusive, not restrained, just accurate. You too, Emily said. The graze wound at the depot. Delray paused. Your pressure call was right. The imaging came back. Radius intact. Good, Emily said. Delray nodded. She moved off down the corridor and Emily watched her go and thought that under different circumstances and with more time, they might have been the kind of colleagues who trusted each other with the complicated parts of the job. Maybe they still would be. The future was less predictable now than it had been when she'd woken up 3 days ago expecting to be transferred off this base in 11 days. 2 weeks passed. Not quietly, nothing about the aftermath of a federal investigation involving a contractor network, a compromised DSS analyst, a military base commander in detention, and an evidence fabrication attempt could accurately be described as quiet. But the pace of it changed. The emergency rhythm gave way to the institutional rhythm, which was slower and more grinding and required a different quality of endurance. Emily remained at Harbor Ridge under orders that had been formally updated. Her rotation was extended indefinitely, pending the investigation's completion, which everyone understood to mean she was staying until the federal proceedings reached a stage where her continued presence was no longer operationally necessary. She went back to medical work during this period with the particular focus of someone who needed the ordinary precision of patient care as a counterweight to everything else. She checked her patients, updated her charts, argued with the commissary about supply timing, ran the perimeter trail before dawn when the weather permitted. She gave 3 more formal statements. She reviewed Pierce's forged document in detail for the forensics team, annotating every discrepancy between it and her actual analytical style. She met twice with the DODIG investigators and once with a JAG representative coordinating Drake's military judicial review. Drake's review was formal and documented and public in the way military proceedings are public. Not broadcast, but accessible to those with standing to access it. The charges that went into that review were significant. Willful suppression of classified intelligence reports, retaliatory personnel action against a protected whistleblower, facilitation of unauthorized reconnaissance access to a federal military installation, and conspiracy to obstruct a federal security investigation. The conspiracy charge was the serious one, the one that moved the case from administrative misconduct into criminal territory, and it was supported by the communication records from the drives Graves had been transporting when Voss's team intercepted the vehicle. The review board met over 3 days. Emily was not present for those 3 days. She had given her statements, her documentation was in the record, and what happened next was the institution processing its own breach, which required her to be a source rather than a participant. She understood this. She worked her shifts, ran her morning miles, answered her phone when Voss's office called. On the 4th day, Voss called personally. The review board returned their findings, he said. Drake has been relieved of all command responsibilities, effective immediately and permanently. His security clearance has been revoked. The military judicial process will proceed on the conspiracy and obstruction charges. His JAG counsel has already been notified. A pause. The board's findings also specifically noted that reports submitted by medical personnel were suppressed in a manner that directly contributed to the security gap exploited by the contractor network. That finding is in this public record. Emily was sitting on the edge of her bed when he told her this. The same bed she'd sat on the night she'd received the second warning message. The night she'd listened to the bass settle into its dark rhythms while something she couldn't see continued to move. "Rourke?" she said. "Federal charges filed yesterday. Obstruction, conspiracy to obstruct a national security investigation, and abuse of his official position. He's agreed to a plea arrangement that includes full cooperation. The cooperation is going to be significant because Rourke has 18 months of knowledge about the contractor network's operation that we need." He paused. "He'll serve time. Less than he would have without the cooperation agreement, but he will serve time." "Pierce?" "Trial date set. No cooperation agreement. He's fighting it, which his lawyer is going to find increasingly difficult as the evidence package becomes clearer." Another pause. Graves was formally discharged and received a 12-month suspended sentence with 2 years probation. His cooperation was the most complete of the 3. She sat with the sequence of it. Drake, Rourke, Pierce, Graves. Solis, who'd received a formal reprimand and been retained in a reassignment that moved her out of the field office and into a role that was, by all available interpretation, a recognition of what she'd actually done rather than a punishment for how she'd done it. "Ms. Carter," Voss said, "there's one more thing." She waited. "The DoD program we mentioned, the Specialized Defense Medical Initiative, the one your actions have been officially credited with preserving, given that the attack's neutralization prevented significant damage to base infrastructure." He paused. "You've been formally nominated to lead the medical assessment component of that program. It's a joint appointment, so part clinical, part operational intelligence support. It would require a full reinstatement of your classified clearance and active service designation." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 4 years she'd spent in hostile environments in a role she'd eventually left because the cost of staying had become a kind of debt she couldn't continue to service. She thought about the 6 months at Harbor Ridge with her notebooks and her deflagged reports and her carefully suppressed knowledge. She thought about the operations center and the 30 seconds she'd asked Carver for, and the way the room had finally, reluctantly, listened. She thought about Del Rey saying good work in the corridor, the flat professional accuracy of it. The way that kind of recognition, small and unadorned, felt more real than a formal commendation because it came from someone who understood what the work actually involved. "What's the timeline on the decision?" she said. "You have 2 weeks," Voss said. "It doesn't have to be yes." "I know," she said. "I'll let you know." The formal commendation ceremony was held on a Friday. The base had the particular atmosphere of a place trying to restore its sense of itself. Some things broken, some things under repair. The community negotiating the difference between what it had believed about its own operation and what the investigation had documented. These negotiations were not clean and they were not fast, and Emily had watched enough of them to know they wouldn't be resolved by a single ceremony. But the ceremony was still worth doing. The installation gathered on the main parade ground. Not everyone, the base still had work running, but a significant portion of the personnel, enough to make the occasion feel like what it was. Commander Albright presided, which was an outcome that would have read as ironic if the context didn't also include his formal acknowledgement of command failure, the reprimand, and what Emily had observed to be a genuine change in how he moved through the installation in the weeks since, less deferential to institutional comfort, more attentive to the specific shape of the things he was being told. She stood at the front of the formation in a dress uniform that had been retrieved from storage and pressed the night before with a care that produced a result that was acceptable but not perfect, because she'd been doing her own pressing for 20 years, and the seam along the left sleeve was never quite right. She'd stopped caring about the seam around year 3. The commendation citation was read aloud. It named her. It named, in specific terms, the actions she'd taken on the day of the attack, the intelligence work that had preceded it, and the role her documentation had played in the subsequent federal investigation. It used formal language that was accurate without being cinematic, which she preferred. It also referenced in general terms her prior service history. Not the details, not the specifics, but an acknowledgement that her actions at Harbor Ridge had been built on a foundation of expertise that the installation had systematically failed to recognize or utilize. That line she had not been expecting. Someone had written that line deliberately. She suspected Aldrich, though she never confirmed it. Albright pinned the commendation to her uniform with hands that were steady and an expression that had the quality of a man doing something that cost him something and choosing to pay it anyway. He stepped back, looked at her, and said, quietly, not for the ceremony, "I should have read your reports." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded once. She faced forward. The base around her was gray sky and harbor smell, and the sound of the water somewhere beyond the perimeter wall. The same water she'd watched on her first day here. The same inlet where the attack had come from. The same geography that had been both the context for 6 months of quiet dismissal and the stage for the morning that had changed everything. She thought about what it costs to keep going when the system keeps telling you you're wrong. When the people with authority and titles and institutional backing look at what you're seeing and decide you're not qualified to see it. She thought about the notebook, the encrypted file, the one flag she'd sent through a channel she wasn't sure anyone was monitoring. She thought about the specific quality of stubbornness required to document things nobody is reading, to hold your assessment steady when everyone around you is confidently pointing a different direction. She had not been perfectly confident. She wanted to be clear about that, even if only to herself. There had been nights, many nights, when she'd sat in these quarters and wondered if she was wrong, if Drake's framing was the accurate one, and she was simply a nurse who didn't understand her scope, who was inserting her particular set of prior experiences into situations where they didn't belong. The doubt had been real. It had been present and persistent, and she had done her work alongside it, not in the absence of it. That was the part that nobody would put in a commendation citation. The part where you keep writing in the notebook even when you're not sure, where you send the flag even when you're not certain anyone will read it, where you ask for 30 seconds in a room that doesn't want you there because the alternative is staying silent, and silence has a cost that accrues the same way debt does, invisibly, and then all at once. After the ceremony, people came to her. Not a crowd. The installation wasn't a movie. Nobody was lining up for a triumphant moment. But people came, individually, The way people do when they've been recalibrating and want to mark the completion of that process in some small human way. Carver, who shook her hand with the particular firmness of someone who'd been thinking about this handshake for 2 weeks. 2 nurses from her unit who said direct, genuine things and then went back to work because there were patients. Ferris, who was 2 months from retirement now, and who looked at her with the particular expression of a man reviewing his own professional record and arriving at a number he didn't love, but was honest enough to accept. "Take the program," Ferris said. "The defense medical thing, take it." "I'm thinking about it," she said. "Stop thinking," he said. "You've been doing this work your whole career. Might as well get the designation that matches what you actually do." She looked at him. "That's the most direct you've been in 6 months," she said. "6 months late," he said. "I know." She said nothing. He nodded and walked away, and that was the end of it, and it was enough. The last person who found her was not someone she expected. Mara Solis had driven up from her reassignment location, a federal facility 2 hours south, without announcing her arrival. Emily saw her standing at the edge of the parade ground as the formation dispersed, her hands in her jacket pockets, watching with the careful attention of someone who'd spent a career noticing things. They walked to the edge of the compound, near the perimeter wall, where the harbor wind came through cleanly and the noise of the base dispersing behind them gave the conversation a kind of privacy that indoors wouldn't have. "You told Voss I was telling the truth," Solis said. "At the depot. He told me." "You were," Emily said. "You didn't know that for certain." "No," Emily said. "But I know what it looks like when someone's been carrying something alone for too long and finally has to set it down." She paused. "I've spent some time doing that myself." Solis looked at the water. "The informants are safe," she said. "Both of them. They've been relocated and the network's knowledge of their identities has been burned." She paused. That was the thing that mattered most. Everything else, the reprimand, the reassignment. "I can live with that." "I know," Emily said. They stood in silence for a moment. The harbor was its usual gray, the water moving in the low chop that came with the coastal wind, and somewhere out on the inlet a boat was making its way south, its navigation light a small orange point in the late afternoon. "What are you going to do?" Solis asked. "The program." "I'm going to take it," Emily said. She said it out loud for the first time, and the saying of it confirmed something she'd already decided somewhere in the previous 2 weeks without fully articulating it. "It's the right designation for the work." "Yes," Solis said. "It is." She left an hour later, and Emily watched the car go and then turned back toward the base and stood there for a moment, alone, in the early dark that came fast this time of year on the coast. She thought about the version of herself that had driven through this gate 6 months ago. 2 duffel bags, a sealed file, the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned to make herself small in environments that preferred her that way. She hadn't wanted to be here. She'd been assigned here, the same way she'd been assigned everywhere, slotted into rotations by people who saw her paperwork and not what was behind it. She had not been welcomed. She had not been trusted. She had been told, in ways small and large and finally explicit, that she was outside her scope, below the threshold, not the kind of person whose assessment mattered. And she had stayed anyway. Not out of stubbornness exactly, though stubbornness was part of it. Not out of certainty, though she'd had more certainty than she'd been given credit for. She had stayed because the pattern she was seeing was real, and the cost of pretending otherwise was paid eventually by people who had nothing to do with the institutional politics that wanted her quiet. That was the only calculus she knew how to run. Not whether she'd be believed, not whether the credit would be correctly assigned. Whether the thing she was seeing was real, and whether someone needed to keep seeing it. The answer had been yes both times. It was usually yes. She went back inside. She had patient charts to update, and a formal program acceptance to draft, and a morning run to complete before it got fully dark, and none of those things were going to do themselves. And she had learned a long time ago that the work on the other side of the hard thing was still just work, which was not a diminishment, but a continuity, the ordinary texture of a life that kept going in the direction you'd pointed it. She had been dismissed, and she had stayed. She had been silenced, and she had documented. She had been removed, and she had been the one who saved them. Not because she was exceptional in the way stories sometimes require, invulnerable, unshaken, always certain, But because she'd been trained to do something specific, and she'd refused to pretend she hadn't been, even when pretending would have been easier, even when every system around her was insisting that her knowledge didn't count and her observations didn't qualify, and her presence was the problem rather than the solution. The people who'd tried to make her small were now answering for it publicly, with their names in federal records and their careers in the past tense. She was still here, still working, still going to run 6 miles before sunrise. She turned off the light in the medical office and walked out into the base and let the cold harbor air hit her face, and it felt, for the first time in 6 months, like breathing without holding anything back. That was enough. That and the work waiting for her in the morning.